African soldiers in world wars, forgotten heroes, the untold stories of colonial troops in global conflicts. They marched in silence, bearing no flags of their own, carrying rifles handed to them by empires that ruled over their lands. They fought on foreign soils, not for conquest or glory, but because they were ordered to. Across the muddy trenches of Europe, under the burning sun of North Africa, through the humid jungles of Burma, and across the shores of the Mediterranean, African soldiers fought and died in two of the most devastating wars the world has ever known. Their blood mixed with that of soldiers from Europe, Asia, and the Americas, but their names, their sacrifices, their stories, remained largely forgotten. These were the colonial troops of Africa, the forgotten heroes of World War I and World War II. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the European empires, France, Britain, Belgium, Germany, looked to their colonies in Africa for manpower and resources. In the name of empire and king, hundreds of thousands of African men were conscripted or coerced into military service. The French recruited heavily from their West African colonies, Senegal, Mali, Guinea, and beyond, raising regiments collectively known as the Tirailleurs Senegalese. Despite the name, these soldiers came from across French West Africa. Britain raised troops from Nigeria, Ghana, then the Gold Coast, Sierra Leone, Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa. They were trained to fight, not as equals, but as tools of empire. Clad in uniforms that bore foreign insignia, these soldiers were dispatched to battlefields that bore no resemblance to the homes they had left behind. In Europe, they faced trench warfare in conditions colder and more brutal than anything they had ever known. In East Africa, they engaged German colonial forces in one of the longest campaigns of the war, enduring tropical diseases, food shortages, and the unrelenting violence of imperial conflict. These African soldiers did not merely support the war effort, they were central to it. They carried ammunition and supplies through treacherous terrain, fought in frontline battles, and maintained critical lines of communication. Many were not even given weapons. Instead, they served as porters, hauling heavy loads over impossible distances. Their suffering was compounded by racism. African troops were often placed in the most dangerous positions, received lower wages than their European counterparts, and were denied promotions or recognition for their bravery. Yet they fought with courage. They held their lines. They sacrificed their lives in wars that were not of their making. The end of World War I did not bring liberation to these soldiers. They returned to colonies still shackled by European domination. Their expectations, hopes for justice, for recognition, for better treatment, were met with silence or repression. But the memory of war, the taste of defiance, the camaraderie and the knowledge of a broader world planted seeds of resistance. These men had fought and died for the freedom of others, and now they began to ask, what about our own freedom? 2 decades later, as the world plunged once again into war, African troops were called upon once more. This time, the scale was even greater. Over 1 million African soldiers were mobilized during World War II by Britain, France, Belgium, and other colonial powers. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma, from the hills of Ethiopia to the shores of Italy and France, African soldiers played a decisive role in the defeat of fascism and Nazism. The Free French forces relied heavily on African troops to liberate occupied territories. In the 1944 Allied landings in southern France, it was African soldiers who spearheaded the initial assault. And yet, even in this moment of triumph, they were denied the dignity of recognition. In an effort known as blanchiment, or whitening, the French command replaced African troops with white soldiers for the official liberation of Paris. The image of white soldiers liberating France was carefully curated, while the African men who had fought through blood and fire were sent to the sidelines. Their absence from the photographs and the ceremonies was not accidental, it was orchestrated. Their contributions, once again, were erased from the memory of Europe. The cruelty did not end with the battles. Many African veterans returned home only to be treated with contempt. Their pensions were denied, their wartime trauma ignored. In 1944, in Fayero, Senegal, a group of demobilized African soldiers protested for their back pay. The French military responded with gunfire, killing dozens, some say hundreds, of their own former soldiers. The massacre at Fayero became a symbol of betrayal, a dark reminder that African blood was welcomed in war but disregarded in peace. In South Africa, black soldiers were recruited into labor units like the Native Military Corps. They served behind the lines, building roads, digging trenches, transporting supplies, essential roles without which the war machine would collapse. Yet they were never permitted to bear arms or fight as equals. Their service was invisible to history books. In British colonies, too, African troops were treated as second-class soldiers. They were issued substandard equipment, subjected to harsh discipline, and paid less than white troops. Yet they stood firm. In Burma, the King's African Rifles from Kenya, Uganda, and Nyasaland fought alongside Indian and British troops in grueling jungle warfare. Their resilience helped turn the tide against Japanese forces. In North Africa, Nigerian, Ghanaian, and Sudanese troops fought bravely in desert battles, enduring extreme heat, sandstorms, and shellfire. These were not nameless auxiliaries, they were men of courage, carrying the weight of empires on their shoulders. Despite the discrimination, despite the erasure, the legacy of African soldiers endures. Their involvement in the world wars was a turning point in Africa's history. The wars exposed the contradictions of colonial rule. How could empires preach freedom while maintaining colonies? How could they demand sacrifice without offering justice? The returning soldiers became politicized. Many joined independence movements, demanding dignity and self-rule. Leaders like Félix Houphouët-Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire and Modibo Keïta of Mali were veterans who translated their wartime experiences into political action. The battlefield had taught them that empires could bleed, that power could shift, that change was possible. In Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and beyond, the post-war years became a time of reckoning. The wars had shaken the foundations of empire. The African soldiers who had fought and died in foreign lands returned as agents of transformation. Today, their stories are slowly being reclaimed. Memorials have been built. Historians have unearthed their names. Books, documentaries, and oral histories now speak their truths. But more must be done. These men were not mere footnotes in European wars, they were participants in world history. Their legacy is not just African, it is global. The freedom many enjoy today was built on the backs of these forgotten heroes. They remind us that history is not only shaped by generals and politicians, but by the millions who marched, who served, who suffered and died without ever asking for glory. Their names may not be etched in every monument, but their legacy lives in the freedom they helped secure. To remember them is not just an act of justice, it is a moral obligation. For every tirailleur Senegalais who charged into battle under a foreign flag, for every South African who dug trenches without a rifle, for every Nigerian who fought in Burma, and for every Ghanaian who died in the deserts of Libya, we owe a debt. Not just of remembrance, but of truth. These were not just African soldiers. They were global heroes. And it is time the world recognized them as such.